beautiful ladies of the world. It's me, Queen Nightmare, and I am going to I'm going to do a story reading of Bram Stoker's first chapter, and it's only the first chapter because it's in the book of horror tales. And if you want me to read the rest of the Bram Stoker book, let me know, because I will read it for you guys. Here I go with the book. Dracula's Guest by Bram Stoker. When we started for our drive, the sun was shining brightly on the Manche, and the air was full of early summer, just as we were about to depart. Air Delbourg, the Montre de Hotel of Quinter-Saisons, where I was staying, came down bareheaded to the carriage, and after wishing me a pleasant drive, said to the coachman, still holding his hand on the handle of the carriage door, "Remember, you are back by nightfall. The sky looks bright, but there is shiver in the north wind that says there may be a sudden storm. But I am sure you will not be late." He smiled and added, "For you know what night it is." Joanne answered with an emphatic "Jaminer," and touching his hat, and drove off quickly. When we had cleared the town, I said, after signaling to him to stop, "Tell me, Joanne, what is tonight?" He crossed himself, and he answered laconically, Walpurgis Nacht. My German isn't that good, but I'll try it again. Walpurgis Nacht. Then he took out his watch, a great old-fashioned German silver thing, as big as a turnip, and looked at it, and his eyebrows gathered together, and a little impotent shrug of his shoulders. I realized that this was the way of respectful protesting against the unnecessary delay, and sank back in the carriage, merely motioning him to proceed. He started off rapidly, as if to make up for lost time, motioning him. Every now and then the horses seemed to throw up their heads, sniff the air suspiciously. On such occasion, I often looked around in alarm. The road was pretty bleak, for we were traversing a sort of high wind-swept plateau. As we drove, I saw a road that looked but little used, and which seemed to dip through a little winding valley. It looked so inviting that, even at the risk of offending him, I called Johann to stop. And when he had pulled up, I told him that I would like to drive down that road. He made all sorts of excuses, and frequently closed himself as he spoke. This somewhat piqued my curiosity, so I asked him various questions. He answered fencely, and repeatedly looked at his watch in protest. Finally I said, "Well, Johann, I want to go down to this road. I shall not ask you to come unless you like. But tell me, why do you not like to go? That is all I ask." For answer, he seemed to throw himself off the box. So quickly did he reach the ground. Then he stretched out his hands, appealing to me, and implored me not to go. There was just enough of England mix with the German for me to understand the drift of his talk. He seemed always just about to tell me something, the very idea of which evidently frightened him, but each time he pulled himself up, saying, as he crossed himself, Welpergis Nacht. I tried to Welsberger Nacht. I tried to argue with him, but it was difficult to argue with a man when I did not know his language. The advantage certainly rested with him, for although he began to speak in English for a very crude and broken kind, he always got excited and broke into his native tongue, and every time he did so, he looked at his watch. Then the horses became restless, sniffed the air. At this, he grew very pale, and looking around in a frightened way, he suddenly jumped forward, took them by the bridles, and led them on some 20 feet. I followed and asked why he had done this. For the answer, he crossed himself, pointed to the spot he had left, and drew his carriage in the direction of the other road, indicating a cross, and said, first in German, then in English, "Buried him what killed themselves." I remembered the old custom of burying suicides at crossroads. "Ah, I see, a suicide. How interesting!" But for the life of me, I could not make out why the horses were frightened. Whilst we were talking, we heard a sort of sound between a yelp and a bark. It was far away, but the horses were very restless, and it took Johann all his time to quiet them. He was pale and said, "It sounds like a wolf, but yet there are no wolves here now." "No?" I asked. I said, questioning him. "Isn't it long since the wolves were so near the city?" Long," he answered. "In the spring and summer. But with the snow, the wolves have been here not so long." Whilst he was petting the horse and trying to quiet them, dark clouds drifted rapidly across the sky. The sunshine passed away, and the breath of the cold wind seemed to drift past us. It was only a breath, however, and more in the nature of a warning than a fact. For the sun came out brightly again. Johann looked under his lifted hand at the horizon and said, "The storm of snow. He comes before a long time." Then he looked at his watch again and straightway held his reins firmly, for the horses were still pawing the ground restlessly and shaking their heads. He climbed to his box as though the time had come for proceeding on our journey. I felt a little obstinate and did not at once get into the carriage. "Tell me," I said, "about this place where the road leads," and I pointed down. Again he crossed himself and mumbled a prayer before he answered, "It is unholy." "What is unholy?" I inquired. "The village." "Then there is a village?" No one lives there for hundreds of years." My curiosity was perked. "But you said there was a village." "There was." "Where is it now?" Whereupon we burst out into a long story in German and English, so mixed up that I could not quite understand exactly what he was saying. But roughly, I gathered that long ago, hundreds of years, men had died there, been buried in their graves, and sounds were heard under the clay. When the graves were opened, men and women were found, rosy with life, and their mouths red with blood. And so, in haste to save their lives, and their souls, and here he crossed himself. Those who were left fled away to other places, where the living lived, and the dead were dead, and not something. He was evidently afraid, and speak the last word. As he proceeded with his narration, he grew more and more excited. It seemed as if his imagination had got hold of him, and he ended in a perfect paroxysm of fear. White-faced prospering, maybe. Trembling and looked around him, as if expecting that some dreadful presence would manifest itself there in the bright sunshine on the open plain. Finally, in an agony of desperation, he cried, "Volsman knocked," and he pointed to the carriage for me to get in. All of a sudden, all my English blood rose at this, and standing back, I said, "You are afraid, Johann. You are afraid. Go home. I shall return alone. The walk will do me good." The carriage door was open. I took from the seat my oak walking stick, which I always carry on my holiday excursions, and closed the door, pointing back to the monarch, and said, "Go home, Johann. Wolfsburg's knocked doesn't concern Englishmen." The horses were now more restive than ever, and Johann was trying to hold them in, while excitedly imploring me not to do anything so foolish. I pitied the poor fellow. He was deeply in earnest, but all the same, I could not help laughing. His English was quite gone now. In his anxiety he had forgotten that his only means of making me understand was to talk my language. So he jabbered away in his native German. It began to be a tedious. After giving the direction, "Home," I turned to go down the cross road into the valley. With a despairing gesture, Johann turned his horse towards Manic. I leaned on my stick and looked after him. He went slowly along the road for a while. Then there came over the crest of the hill a man tall and thin. I could see so much in the distance. When he drew near the horses, they began to jump and kick about, then to scream with horror. Johann could not hold them in. They bolted down the road, running away madly. I watched them out of sight, then looked for the stranger, but I found that he too was gone. With a light heart, I turned down the side road through the deepening valley, to which Johann had objected. There was not the slightest reason that I could see for his objection. And I dare say I tramped a couple of hours without thinking of time or distance, and certainly without seeing a person or a house, so far as the place was concerned. It was desolation itself, but I did not notice this particular till, on turning a bend in the road, I came upon a scattered fringe of wood. Then I recognized that it had been impressed unconsciously by the desolation of the region through which I had passed. I sat down to rest myself and began to look around. It struck me that it was considerably cold, colder than it had been at the commencement of my walk. A sort of sighing sound seemed to be around me, with now and then, high overhead, a sort of muffled roar. Looking upwards, I noticed that great thick clouds were drifting rapidly across the sky from north to south at a great height. There were signs of coming storms in some lofty stratum of the air. I was a little chilly, and thinking that it was the sitting still after the exercising of walking, I resumed my journey. The ground I passed over was now much more picturesque. There was no striking objects that the eye might single out. But in all there was a charm of beauty. I took little heed of time, and it was only when the deepening twilight forced itself upon me that I began to think of how I should find my way home. The brightness of the day had gone. The air was cold, and the drifting of clouds high overhead was more marked. They were accompanied by a short off, far away rushing sound, through which seemed to come at intervals that mysterious cry which the driver had said came from a wolf. For a while I hesitated. I had said I would see the deserted village, so I went on, and presently came on a wide stretch of open country, shut in by hills all around. Their sides were covered with trees, which spread down into the plain, dotting in clumps the gentler slopes and hollows, which showed here and there. I followed with my eye and the winding of the road, and saw that it curved close to the one densest of these clumps, and was lost behind it. As I looked, there came a cold shiver in the air, and the snow began to fall. I thought of the miles and miles of bleak country I had passed, and then hurried on to seek the shelter in front. Darker and darker grew the sky, and faster and heavier fell the snow, till the earth before and around me was a glistening white carpet, and the further edge of which was lost in misty vagueness. The road was here but crude, and when on the level, its boundaries were not so marked as when it passed through the cuttings, and in little while I found that I must have strayed from it, for I missed underfoot the hard surface, and my feet sank deeper by the grass and moss. Then the wind grew stronger and blew with ever increasing force, till I was fain to run before it. The air became icy cold and in spite of my exercise, I began to suffer. The snow was now falling as thickly and whirling around me in such rapid eddies that I could hardly keep my eyes open. Every now and then the heavens were torn asunder by vivid lightning, and in the flashes I could see ahead of me a great mass of trees, chiefly yew and cypress, all heavy coated with snow. I was soon amongst the shelters of the trees, and there in cooperative silence I could hear the rush of the wind high overhead. Presently the blackness of the stream and became merged in the darkness of the night. By and by the storm seemed to be passing away. It now only came in fierce puffs or blasts. At such moments the weird sound of the wolf appeared to be echoed by many similar sounds around me. Now and again, through the black mass of drifting cloud, came a strangling ray of moonlight, which lit up the expanse and showed me that I was at the edge of the dense mass of cypress and yew trees. As the snow had ceased to fall, I walked out from the shelter and began to investigate more closely. It appeared to me that amongst so many old foundations I had passed there might still be standing a house in which, though in ruins, I could find some sort some sort of shelter for a while. As I skirted the edges of the copse, I found that a low wall encircled it, and following this, I presently found an opening. Here the cypress founded, formed an alley leading up to a square mass of some kind of building. Just as I thought I caught sight of this, however, the drifting clouds obscured the moon, and I passed the path of darkness, and the wind must have grown colder, for I felt myself shiver as I walked. But there was hope of shelter, and I groped my way blindly on. I stopped, for there was a sudden stillness. The storm had passed, and perhaps in sympathy with nature's silence, my heart seemed to cease to beat. But this was only momentarily, for suddenly the moonlight broke through the clouds, showing me that I was in a graveyard, and that the square objects before me was a great massive tomb of marble, as white as the snow, and lay on and all around it. With the moonlight there came a fierce sigh of the storm, which appeared to resume its course with a long, low howl, as of many dogs or wolves. I was awed and shocked, and felt the cold perceptible grow upon me, till it seemed to grow me by the heart. Then, while the flood of moonlight still fell on the marble tomb, the storm gave further evidence of renewing, as though it was returning on its track. I, impelled by some sort of fascination, I approached the sculpture to see what it is, and why such a thing stood alone in such a place. I walked around it and read over the Doric door in German, Countess de Logen of Graz in Styria, sought and found dead, 1801. On the top of the tomb, seemingly driven through the solid marble, for the sculpture was composed of few vast blocks of stone, was a great iron spike or stake. On going to the back, I saw graven in great Russian letters, "The dead travel fast." There was something so weird and uncanny about the weird thing that gave me a turn and made me feel quite faint. I began to wish for the first time that I had taken Joanne's advice. Here a thought struck me, which came under almost mysterious circumstances with a terrible shock. This was Walpurgis night, when, according to the belief of millions of people, the devil was abroad. When the graves were opened, the dead came forth and walked, when all evil things of the earth and air and water held revel. This very place the driver had specially shunned. This was the depopulated village of centuries ago. This was where the suicide lay. And this was the place where I was alone, unmanned, shivering with cold in a shroud of snow, with a wild storm gathering again upon me. It took all my philosophy, all the religion I had been taught, with all my courage, not to collapse in a paroxysm of fright. And now a perfect tornado burst upon me. The ground shook as though thousands of horses thundered across it, and the time the storm bore on its icy wings no snow, but great hailstones, which drove with such violence that they might have come from the throngs of barrack slingers, hailstones that beat down leaf and branch and made the shelter of cypresses of no more avail than though their stems were standing corn. All at the first I had rushed to the nearest tree, but I was soon fain to leave it and seek the only spot that seemed to afford refuge, and it was the Doric doorway of the marble tomb. There I crouching against the massive bronze door, I gained certain amount of protection from the beating of the hailstones, for now they only drove against me as they ricocheted off the ground and side of the marble. As I leaned against the door, I moved slightly and opened inwards. The shelter of even a tomb was opening in the pitiless tempest, and I was about to enter it when there came a flash of forked lightning that lit up the whole expanse of heavens. In the instant, as I am a living man, I saw, as my eyes were turned into the darkness of the tomb, a beautiful woman, with rounded cheeks and red lips, seemingly sleeping in a bier. As the thunder broke overhead, I was grasped as by the hand of a giant and hurled into the storm. The whole thing was so sudden that before I could realize the shock, moral as well physical, I found the hailstone beating me down. That at the same time I had a strange, dominating feeling that I was not alone. I looked towards the tomb. Just then there came another blinding flash, which seemed to strike the iron stake and surmounted the tomb, to pour through to the earth, blasting and crumbling to the marble. As in a burst of flame, the dead woman rose for a moment of agony. While she was lapped in the flame, her bitter scream of pain was drowned in the thunder crash. The last thing I heard was this mingling of dreadful sound as, again, I was seized in a giant grasp and dragged away, while the hailstones beat on me, and the air around seemed reverberant. I can't say that. with the howling of wolves. The last sight that I remembered was a vague, white, moving mass, as if all the graves around me had sent out the phantoms of their sheeted dead, and that they were closing in on me through the white cloudiness of the driving hail. Gradually there came a sort of vague beginning of consciousness, then a sense of weariness that was dreadful. For a time I remembered nothing, but slowly my senses returned. My feet seemed positively racked with pain, but I could not move them. They seemed to be numbed. There was an icy feeling at the back of my neck and all down my spine. My ears, like my feet, were dead, yet in torment. But there was in my breast a sense of warmth, which was by comparison delicious. It was a nightmare, a physical nightmare. If one may use such an expression, for some heavy weight on my chest made it difficult for me to breathe. This period of lethargy seemed to remain a long time, and as it faded away, I must have slept or swooned. Then came a sort of loathing, like the first stage of seasickness, and a wild desire to be free from something I knew not what. A vast stillness enveloped me, as though all the world were asleep or dead, only broken by the low panting as of some animal close to me. I felt a warm rasping at my voice. Then came a consciousness of awful truth, which chilled me to the heart and sent the blood surging up through my brain. Some great animal was lying on me, and now licking my throat. I feared to stir, for some instinct of prudence bade me lie still, but the brute seemed to realize that there was now some change in me, for it raised its head. Through my eyelashes I saw above me 2 great flaming eyes of a gigantic wolf. Its sharp white teeth gleamed in a gaping red mouth, and I could feel its hot breath, fierce and acrid upon me. For another spell of time I remembered no more than I became conscious of a low growl, followed by a yelp, renewed again and again. Then, seemingly very far away, I heard a hello, as many voices calling in unison. Cautiously, I raised my head and looked in the direction whence the sound came, but the cemetery blocking my view, the wolf still continued to yelp in a strange way. The red glare began to move round the grove of cypresses, as though following the sound. As the voices drew closer, the wolf yelped faster and louder. I feared that to make either sound or motion. Nearer came the red glow. Over the white pall, which stretched into the darkness around me. Then, all at once, from beyond the trees, there came at the trot of a troop of horsemen bearing torches. The wolf rose from my breast and made for the cemetery. I saw one of the horsemen soldiers by their caps and long military cloaks raise his carbine and take aim. A companion knocked up his arm, and I heard the ball wheeze over his head. He had eventually taken my body for that of the wolf. Sorry, I had to rub my nose. Another sighted the animal as it slunk away, and a shot followed. Then, at a gallop, the troop rode forward, some towards me, others followed the wolf, as it disappeared amongst the snow-clad cypresses. As they drew nearer, I tried to move, but was powerless, although I could see and hear all that went on around me. 2 or 3 of soldiers jumped from their horses and knelt beside me. One of them raised my head and placed his hand over my heart. "Good news, comrades," he cried. His heart still beats. Then some brandy was poured down my throat. It put vigor into me, and I was able to open my eyes fully and looked around. Lights and shadows were moving around among the trees, and I heard men call to one another. They drew together, uttering frightened exclamations, and the lights flashed as the others came pouring out of the cemetery pell-mell like men possessed. When the further ones came close to us, those who were around me asked them eagerly, "Well, have you found him?" The reply rang hurriedly, No, come away, quick, there's no place to stay, and on this of all nights, what was it?" Was the question asked in all manners of keys. The answer came variously and all indefinitely, as though the men were moved by some common impulse to speak, yet were restrained by some common fear from giving their thoughts. It indeed, jabbered one, whose wit had plainly given out for the moment. "A wolf, and yet not a wolf," another put in shudderingly. "No use trying for him without a sacred bullet," a third remarked in a more ordinary manner. "Serve us right for coming out on this night. Truly we have earned our 3rd marks. were the ejaculations of the fourth one. There was blood on the broken marble, another said after a pause. The lightning never brought that there. And for him, is he safe? Look at his throat. See, comrades, the wolf has been lying on him and keeping his blood warm. The officer looked at my throat and replied, "He's all right. The skin is not pierced." What does it all mean? We should never have found him, but the yelping of the wolf. What became of it? Asked the man who was holding up my head and who seemed the least panic-stricken of the party, for his hands were steady and without tremor. On his sleeve was a chevron of a petty officer. "It went to its home," answered the man, whose long face was pallid, and who actually shook his terror as he glanced around him fearfully. "There are graves enough there in which it may lie. Come, comrades, come quickly. Let us leave this cursed place." The officer raised me to a sitting position as he uttered a word of command. Then several men placed me upon a horse. I sprang to the saddle behind me. He sprang to a saddle behind me, took me in his arms, gave the word to advance, and turning our faces away from cypresses, we rode away in swift military order. As yet, my tongue refused its office. I perforced silence. I must have fallen asleep, for the next thing I remembered was finding myself standing up, supported by a soldier on each side of me. It was almost broad daylight, and to the north, red streak of sunlight was reflected with a path of blood over the waste of the snow. The officer was telling the men to say nothing of what they had seen, except that they found an English stranger guarded by a large dog. "Dog? That was a dog. That was not a dog," cut the man who had exhibited such fear. "I think I know a wolf when I see one," the young officer answered calmly. "I said a dog." "Dog?" reiterated the other ironically. It was evident that his courage was rising with the sun, and pointing to me, he said, "Look at his throat." "Is that a work of the dog, master?" Instinctively, I raised my hand to my throat, and as I touched it, I cried out in pain. The men crowded around to look. Some stooped down from their saddles, and again they came the calm voice of a young officer. "A dog, as I said. If aught else were said, we should only be laughed at." I was then mounted behind a trooper, and we rode on into the suburbs of Monarch. Here we came across a stray carriage, into which I was lifted and driven off to Quantor stations, the young officer accompanying me, whilst a trooper followed with his horse, and the other rode off to their barracks. When we arrived, Herr Dilbrook rushed as so quickly down the steps to meet me that it was apparent he had been watching within. Taking me by both hands, he solicitously led me in. The officer saluted me and was turning to withdraw when I recognized his purpose and insisted that he should come to my rooms. Over a glass of wine, I warmly thanked him and his brave comrades for saving me. He replied simply that he was more than glad, and the Herr Delbruck had at the first taken step to make all the searching party pleased, at which ambiguous utterance the maître d'hôtel smiled, while the officer pleaded duty and withdrew. "But Herr Delbruck," I inquired, "hey, and how and why was it that the soldiers searched for me?" He shrugged his shoulders as if in disapprobation of his own deed, as he replied, "I was so fortunate as to obtain leave from the commander of the regiment in which I served to ask for volunteers." "But how did you know I was lost?" I asked. "The driver came hither with the remains of his carriage, which had been upset when the horses ran away." "But surely you would not send a search party of soldiers merely on this account?" "Oh, no," he answered. "But even before the coachman arrived, I had this telegram from the Bayard, whose guest you are." He took from his pocket a telegram, which he handed to me, and I read, "Betrist. Be careful of my guest. His safety is most precious to me. Should aught happen to him, or if he be missed, spare nothing to find him and ensure his safety. He is English, therefore adventurous. There are often dangers from snow and wolves and night. Lose not a moment of if you suspect him to harm to him. I answer your zeal with my fortune. From Dracula." As I held the telegram in my hand, the room seemed to whirl around me, and if the attentive maître d'hôtel had not caught me, I think I should have fallen. There was something so strange in all this, something so weird and impossible to imagine, that there grew on me a sense of my being in some way the sport of opposite forces, the mere vague idea of which seemed in a way to paralyze me. I was certainly under some form of mysterious protection. From a distant country had come in very nick of time a message that took me out of the danger of snow, sleep, and the jaws of a wolf. that is a sneak peek of Bram Stoker's Dracula. And I have to say this. I have watched the movie of Dracula, and even that's kind of wow. Don't mind the book. The book is amazing. It's very slow going, but then once you read it, you go, oh wow, dang, oh yeah, that's good. It's action filled, but it's so wordy that sometimes you can fall asleep while reading it. But it's a very good book. I like it. I also have Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I also have Frankenstein's Monster. I have those books. I can read you those. And, well, I have to say, if you want more, I'm going to do other stories here. I'm going to actually record my 12th part of my book right now, but please like, comment, and subscribe. There is a watermark over there in the bottom, I think, right corner. Right corner to me, left corner to you. Sorry. Click on that red subscribe button and turn on push notifications to be notified every time I post. I love you guys so much. Please be my good little nightmares and have sweet dreams. Bye.